Hillarinos, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series where I tell you all about the history of the European Reformation. Today we're going to talk about a man who did more travelling in the 1500s than we're going to manage this year. We're going to talk about Charles V, or Charles I, depending on who you ask. He had a lot of titles, and I'm going to read this because I can't remember it. Charles, Emperor of the Romans, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of all Spains.
Of Castile, Aragon, Leon, of Hungary, of Dalmatia, of Croatia, Navarra, Granada, Toledo, Valencia, Galicia, Mallorca, Sevilla, Cordova, Murcia, Jaén, Algarve, Algeciras, Gibraltar, the Canary Islands, King of two Sicilies, of Sardinia, Corsica, King of Jerusalem, King of the Indies, of the islands, and the mainland of the ocean sea, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Brabant, Lorraine, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Limburg, Luxembourg, Gelderland, Neopatia, Württemberg, Landgrave of Alsace, Prince of Savoia, Asturia, and Empire Burgau, Oristano, Bracciano, Lord of Frisia, the Wendish March, Pordenone, Biscay, Morin, Salins, Tripoli,
And Macon. I need a drink after that. Look, you got a sped up version, imagine how long that took me. Needless to say, the man was busy. We have a lot to cover. Let's go. Part 1. Early life. Charles Habsburg was born to Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad. It was 1500. They weren't very considerate of mental illnesses, okay? He was born in the Low Countries in the year 1500. When he was very young, his grandmother, Isabella of Castile, died, and there was a succession crisis in Spain. I've spoken about that before, and I'll put a link to that video up here somewhere. I will also talk about it in more detail later in this season, but it's not time for it yet. In short, the beloved queen died, full-on war over who should take over. Two of the people who wanted to take over were Charles's parents. Joanna was Isabella's daughter, so it just made sense, and she was arguably, the rightful heir. So they fucked off to Spain and left their son. He was effectively parentless. And he was raised by his Aunt Margaret, who also happened to be Archduchess of Austria. When he was young, he was only the heir apparent to the Low Countries, so he was widely known as Charles of Ghent, and that was sort of throughout his entire youth. That's not to say he wasn't gaining insane power. As a child, in 1506, he became Lord of the Netherlands as Duke of Burgundy, and the mathematical amongst you will realise that made him 6 years old. When I was 6, I broke my arm jumping on a bed. It's not relevant, it's just a fun fact. He was educated by Adrian of Utrecht, who would later become Pope Adrian VI. It's handy to know a pope, that's all I'm saying. It might be useful later, Moving on to part 2. Not so popular in Spain. So his parents did become King and Queen of Castile, but in 1506 his dad died, which left Joanna in charge. As I mentioned before, she was known as Joanna the Mad because she suffered with mental illnesses. Possibly this was a result of the generations of incest, but now these generations of incest also caused the famous Habsburg jaw, which was an enlarged jaw, to the point where a lot of the later Habsburgs would dribble constantly because their jaw was so far out from the rest of their face. It's also likely why Charles was epileptic. So in 1516 he became joint monarch of Spain with his mother. Spain wasn't really one country at this point. In particular, he inherited two places. Castile, the largest of the two and probably the more authoritarian monarchy, more like how you'd imagine a monarchy in the 1500s. They control everything, they have ultimate power. Castile had been under the rule of his grandmother, Isabella. And Aragon, which was the other part of Spain that he inherited, had been under the rule of his grandfather, Ferdinand. In Aragon, people had a lot more input into their ruler, into their monarchy. It was seen as more of a contract with the people than just ultimate power like it was in Castile. It was a very different system. Now, when Joanna came to power, it was only in Castile. Ferdinand was still alive, so he took full control of Aragon. His father, Philip the Handsome, and his granddad, Maximilian I, had declared Joanna mad, so she was forcibly confined to a royal palace in Tordesillas. This happened before Charles came to the throne. Some people think she was experiencing psychosis or schizophrenia. and obviously they weren't understood or accepted in the early 1500s. They're widely misunderstood now. So in 1507 she's confined to this castle. However, it's possible Joanna the Mad wasn't mad at all. Despite some major feminist progress from Isabella video incoming, this was still the 16th century, and the hysterical woman viewpoint was widely accepted. Men were just more trusted by the majority. So her husband and his father, Maximilian I, who was Holy Roman Emperor at the time, had a lot to gain by having Joanna effectively committed. So in 1516 Charles becomes co-monarch, and for a very short while Joanna is no longer shut in a tower, basically. But she's only freed for less than a year before she's confined to it again and declared insane again. Now this isn't a fact, but it isn't too wild to think that maybe he had the same thought as his dad and granddad, and he saw the power he could have with her out of the picture. By 1517 he was effectively the sole monarch of Spain. Whilst Aragon, as I already mentioned, was quite opposed to giving a foreigner like Charles power, thanks to pressure from his granddad, who was Holy Roman Emperor, and from Pope Leo X, it's always handy to have friends in high places. When Joanna succumbed to illness, he did take over Aragon as well, but there were terms, and these terms applied to his rule over Castile as well. People were largely very concerned that Charles, who had not been raised in Spain, was not Spanish, would try and bring a lot of foreign power and sort of imperial interest to Spain. He had to learn Castilian. At the time he only spoke French and Dutch, which really didn't help with Spain viewing him as a foreigner. On that note, he wasn't allowed to appoint foreigners to any positions of power, and he guaranteed that he wouldn't take precious metals from Castile and funnel them into imperial interests. That money was to stay in Spain. Now, despite him being crowned king, the Spanish people were still quite wary of Charles. His younger brother, Ferdinand II, was who they'd wanted as king. Still of royal blood, he'd been raised in Castile. He was seen as more suited to the Spanish throne than Charles, who for a lot of people would come to be known as the idiot king. Now, this unhappiness amongst the general population about Charles becoming king would lead to two major uprisings. There was the Comuneros revolt in 1520. This was a Castilian uprising. At one point the people had taken control of the cities of Valladolid, Tordesillas and Toledo. This broke out basically when Charles was promised to become Holy Roman Emperor after his granddad died, and he just sort of fucked off Spain and went to Germany, well, what is now Germany. He left Adrian of Utrecht, who we mentioned before, to just rule in his absence. Again, really not a Spanish person, not Castilian. People weren't happy about it. You know, he was a Dutchman, he was a foreigner. There were riots and city councils took power of various places because they wanted to see Joanna back on the throne. They felt she was more suited to the throne than her son, who didn't understand the customs of Castile. This escalated and became peasants rebelling against nobility, a classic peasants' revolt situation. In 1521, Charles finally organised his supporters and they won the Battle of Valhalla, and leaders of this revolt were all beheaded. Then there was the Brotherhood's Revolt in 1522. This was really down to the artisan guilds in Aragon. Again, completely different political situation in Aragon and Castile, hence why these are such distinct revolts. Whilst it was against Charles's rule primarily, there was a strong anti-Islamic sentiment that ran through the whole movement, and throughout this revolt many Islamic people were forcibly converted to Christianity. This can be traced back to the 1519 Valencian plague. This was viewed as a punishment from God. People turned against what they felt was sinful behaviour, and in this situation that would be homosexuals, the gays, and Islamic people. Charles's absence when he swanned off to become Holy Roman Emperor, there was all-out war. I would love to talk about this in detail. There is so much to this that I just don't have time to cover in this video. But if you'd like to know more about it, let me know in the comments and I will go into way more detail. But in short, they burnt down the Islamic parts of Valencia, but they would eventually surrender to a royalist army. There were multiple attempts to resurrect the riots until like 1523. Anyone involved was executed. If they were struggling to find someone, they'd put enormous bounties on their heads and they would be found and killed. Not a great start, Charlie boy. We'll head back to Spain. But first, let's talk about the reason Charles is known as Emperor Charles in most history books. Part 3. A splintering empire. Quick geography lesson. The Holy Roman Empire encompassed modern-day Germany, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Austria, Croatia, Bulgaria and the Netherlands, as well as parts of Poland, France and Italy. A lot to manage. There were a lot of people in very different communities with very different customs. Now, the imperial princes nominate the leader of this land. They nominated Charles to do this in 1519. You may be wondering why the princes nominated a 19-year-old who was already responsible for Spain and the Low Countries. Place your guesses now. You guessed nepotism and money. Congratulations. Some things never change. Yeah, so Charlie Boy's old gramps, like we said before, was Maximilian I, previous Holy Roman Emperor, which did help with him trying to take the position, but he secured the job with extensive bribery. Don't have a number, and honestly it'd be difficult to translate that number into modern money anyway. Given all of the candidates would have probably tried to bribe the electorate, you can assume it was quite a lot. So Charles beats out the competition, and it was some hefty competition. Other people running at this time was Frederick of Saxony, who we mentioned a lot in our Luther videos. There was Henry VIII, King of England, yes, that one, and Francis I of France. A rivalry that would truly never die. We'll get back to that. Essentially, here's a quick fair summary of this video. If you want more detail, go there. But in short, a monk was super over Catholicism, built on greed and scamming illiterate people who were desperate to get to heaven. So he put some demands on a church door. The ideas went global, he wouldn't take it back, and the Pope was very worried. So enter Charles. Now, as he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, Charles had guaranteed that all German people had a right to a fair trial. And what was this monk? German. Now, of course, he wouldn't get a fair trial on the Pope's home turf. Charles organised the Diet of Worms for Martin Luther, the monk, to argue his case. And it was Charles who signed off on the Edict of Worms, condemning Martin Luther as a heretic. This began a continent-wide religious schism as Protestantism spread like wildfire, and there were decades of war. Here's a video all about that, the backbone of the Reformation, but this is a video about Charles. A lot of people think Charles's guarantee of a fair trial was the beginning of his downfall. He was just 19 at the time. It's widely believed his inability to maintain Catholicism across Europe led to his mental health declining in later life. The Holy Roman Emperor was supposed to be the defender of the faith, and Charles believed he was sent by God to become leader of a large Christendom. So watching a united Christendom crumble throughout his role broke him mentally. Anyway, back to Spain. Chapter 4. Early colonialist fucks. As the sun goes, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This isn't a video about Columbus or how we might have shagged a llama, but my point is the Americas were still a recent discovery. They actually offered Charles his greatest source of income in the form of precious metals, mainly silver, that was stolen from South America. It would eventually cause insane inflation and bankrupt the entirety of Spain. Classic. I digress. Most of what I've shared about Charles has been not positive, but when we factor in the 500 years ago thing, mostly sort of forgivable. But there's one factor of Charles's legacy that is truly horrific. I considered only mentioning this at the end of the video, but I didn't want to end on that note, and I didn't really know how to tie off a video after saying it, so... In 1518, he made the already existing slave trade more direct. So prior to this, people would be taken from mainly North Africa, taken to Spain and Portugal to be Christianized, then sent over to the Americas. He made it so people were taken directly from Africa to the Americas. Because this was cheaper, the slave trade grew exponentially to a scale never before. It's believed 2 million people would die on these ships over the next 3 centuries. This was made possible in part by Charles bringing this in. Yeah, the title of this chapter makes sense now, doesn't it? Now, Charles established a feudal system identical to Spain's in the Americas. This was widely disliked by Spanish people because it meant some Native Americans were equal to some Spaniards. Charles's son would ultimately overturn this. Most of his policy in relation to the Americas protected natives. Having said that, he encouraged people to go conquer parts of America for Spain, and the part he played in the slave trade shows that he obviously didn't value all humans equally. I'm not excusing his actions, to be clear. I just think it's worth pointing out. Ultimately, both the Aztec and Inca empires were conquered by Spain under Charles's rule. He appointed viceroys of New Spain and Peru in 1519 and 1542, and he is credited with the initial idea of the Panama Canal in 1520. Moving on to what number am I on? Chapter 5, War and Love. Charles was described by Marcantonio Contarini as not greedy of territory, but most greedy of peace and quiet. Now that could fool you into thinking he had a fully peaceful reign. Wrong! Although most of his wars were defensive, when he wasn't fighting this wave of Protestantism, he was at war with France and the Ottoman Empire to ensure he kept control of all of his lands. Suleiman the Magnificent and Francis I certainly contributed to the quarter of Charles's life that he spent on the road. In his own words, "My life has been one long journey." This journey included 10 trips to the Low Countries, 9 trips to the Holy Roman Empire, 7 trips to Spain, 7 trips to the Italian states that fell under his rule, 4 trips to France, 2 trips to England, and 2 trips to North Africa. Bear in mind, this is the early 1500s. This is by horse, cart, and ships with no engines. Hundreds of days spent on the road to manage complex interests across many territories. In many ways, he never stood a chance. His life wasn't without love. He had an affair with his step-grandma, Germaine de Foix, because incest ran in the family. But unlike most rulers of the time, once he married, he didn't have any known affairs, and he never remarried after he lost his wife. So let's talk about his wife, Isabella of Portugal. Prior to marrying Isabella, Charles was engaged to 6-year-old Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter. This was to try and establish an alliance with England to help him against the French. Obviously, they couldn't get married until Mary was a lot older, and essentially Charles got tired of waiting. He called off the engagement, and a political alliance with Portugal would also be highly beneficial to him. Despite this being the original basis of their marriage, just, trying to create a political alliance, by all accounts they fell madly in love almost immediately. They honeymooned in Alhambra and had a happy marriage for 13 years until Isabella had a miscarriage that became sepsis and tragically died. A tragically common occurrence in 16th century Europe. God bless modern medicine. Charles shut himself in the monastery of Yuste for 2 months to grieve, mourn, and pray in solitude. He'd wear black for the rest of his life, and he'd never remarry, despite not even being 40 when Isabella passed away. Most men in the power at this time would remarry to secure new alliances or the same alliance. But Charles never did. He spent the rest of his life in mourning. Chapter 6. Passing it on. Between 1554 and 1556, Charles abdicated all of his positions, passing some on to his brother and some to his son, dividing up the Habsburgs into a Spanish line and an Austrian line. Son Philip II took over Spain and Portugal, and would later marry Mary I of England, become king there too. He gave his brother Ferdinand I Austria, which he had essentially been ruling for Charles as regent since 1521. He also got Hungary, Croatia and the Holy Roman Empire. If you're thinking, hang on, isn't the Holy Roman Emperor meant to be voted in? You'd be right. This actually set a precedent of the title being inherited, without which Germany would never have had Kaiser Wilhelm II, and we all know how that turned out. I'm not saying Charles V caused World War I. I'm not. Charles returned to a monastery, the monastery of Yuste, again in Extremadura in Spain. Most of his time in a room surrounded by clocks. Some people think this was to symbolise running out of time, but who knows. I read somewhere that he basically went mad taking apart and putting back together these clocks. It wasn't in many sources, so take it with a pinch of salt. Charles would die in 1558 of malaria, holding the cross his wife has held when she died. His legacy was largely shrouded by the powerful legacy of his predecessors and the spread of Protestantism under his reign. Thank you so much if you've made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this, please give me a cheeky like and subscribe. I'd love to hear your opinions of Charles in the comments. Was he a product of his time, a good king, a bad king? Let me know. This is a simplified version of events, and if I touched on anything you want to know more about, please also let me know in the comments. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye! Frankenstein! Man! You're not allowed up there! I'm gonna have to edit this video more now.